On the Edge of Sanity. Chapter 1. The descent begins. It was an ordinary Thursday afternoon when Emma received the call. Her father, once a towering figure of logic and reason, had slipped into a deep, almost incomprehensible madness. It was his third episode in as many months. Panic rose in Emma's chest as she stood by the phone, listening to the trembling voice on the other end. In the days that followed, Emma found herself overwhelmed by doubt. What if her father had always been this way, and she had simply missed it? What if she, too, was destined to follow him into the abyss? Emma was certain that it was something more than just a mental illness. There was a creeping sensation in her bones that there was something darker at play, something she couldn't yet understand. Chapter 2. The shadows in the walls. Emma moved back to the old family house to care for her father. The house, dark and brooding, had always been a place of warmth for her as a child, but now it felt like a prison. The air smelled of dust and decay. Strange noises echoed at night, whispers from unseen corners. Her father would mutter things that made no sense, his words lost in the haze of his deteriorating mind. Emma could never shake the feeling that someone was watching her. One night, Emma woke to find her father standing in the hallway, his eyes wide with terror, staring at the walls. When she approached, he whispered, "They're here, Emma. They're always here." The next day, Emma began to investigate the house. She found an old journal buried deep in her father's study. The pages were filled with strange symbols and cryptic references to voices and shadows. Was her father just insane, or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? Chapter 3. Unraveling the threads. As Emma delved deeper into her father's past, she discovered unsettling truths. Her father had once been involved in obscure scientific research, dabbling in realms of the unknown that were better left untouched. His journals spoke of experiments with the human mind, and there were mentions of entities, beings that existed beyond the veil of reality. Emma's own sanity began to fray as she connected the dots. The voices her father had heard, the whispers in the dark, the shifting shadows, all of it pointed to a horrifying conclusion. She began to see strange things in the corners of her vision, figures that disappeared when she turned her head. Every time she slept, the nightmares grew worse. The line between the waking world and the world of dreams blurred. Chapter 4. The Call of Madness. One evening, Emma found herself alone in the study, the journal open in front of her. A strange compulsion took hold of her, and she began to trace the symbols with her finger. As she did, the room seemed to warp and twist. The air grew thick, suffocating. A voice echoed in her mind, a voice that was not her own. "Join us," it whispered. Emma snapped back, heart pounding. The voice lingered. It felt real, more real than anything she had ever known. The symbols in the journal began to shift before her eyes, and she realized she was no longer just reading about her father's madness. She was being drawn into it. In that moment, Emma understood that the descent into madness wasn't just something her father had experienced. It was something that was happening to her as well. Chapter 5. Lost in the dark. Days blurred together as Emma spiraled further into a mental abyss. The house seemed to be alive, the walls breathing, the shadows moving on their own. Her father's condition worsened, and Emma was no longer sure if he was speaking to her or to the dark presence that seemed to haunt them both. The more Emma tried to fight the madness creeping into her mind, the more it consumed her. There were moments when she would lose all sense of time, wandering the halls of the house in a trance, unable to remember how she had gotten there. Her father's whispers grew louder, merging with the voices in her own head. One night, as the moonlight spilled across the floor, Emma found herself standing in front of the mirror in the hallway. Her reflection was twisted, her eyes dark and hollow. She reached out to touch the glass, and the reflection reached back. Chapter 6. The truth beneath the veil. As Emma's grip on reality began to slip, she uncovered the final piece of the puzzle. Her father's research had been part of a larger, much darker plan, a ritual designed to open a doorway between the living world and the realm of the dead. The beings her father had been communicating with were not mere hallucinations. They were real, ancient, and powerful. Emma realized with horror that she had unwittingly become a part of the ritual. The voices in her head, the whispers, the shadows, it had all been leading to this. She was the key, and she had unknowingly opened the door. But even as she grasped the terrifying truth, she could feel the pull of the darkness calling to her. The boundary between her mind and the world beyond was thinning, and there was no turning back. Chapter 7. Into the abyss. The final night arrived, and Emma stood in the center of the living room, the journal in her hands. The house was silent, but she could feel the weight of the presence surrounding her. Her father had fallen, silent, his eyes hollow, as if something had finally claimed him entirely. She closed her eyes, hearing the voices calling her name. She could see the shadowy figures in her mind reaching out to her, beckoning her into the dark abyss. The room began to pulse, the walls shifting, the air thick with the stench of decay. It was no longer just her father. who had lost his mind. Emma was teetering on the edge of sanity herself. A choice loomed before her: surrender to the darkness and let it consume her, or fight and risk losing herself forever. Chapter 8: The Edge of Sanity. Emma stood on the precipice, her mind shattered by the horrors she had uncovered. She could feel the darkness closing in, its cold tendrils wrapping around her. The boundary between her and the unknown had dissolved completely, and she was no longer sure which world was real. With one final, desperate scream, she let go of the journal and stepped forward. In that moment, the house seemed to collapse in on itself, the walls dissolving into nothingness. Emma was lost to the void, her mind fragmented and scattered. And so, Emma's story ended not with peace, but with the eternal question of what lies beyond the veil. The edge of sanity had become her final destination.